And I am introducing our next talk. This episode of Between the Two Cacti, which they are coming soon. Dr. Brian Korgel will discuss with Luke Bassett on how the Energy Institute is shaping and reshaping the local economies in various regions in the US and how our elected officials are responding. Dr. Brian Korgel is the director of the Energy Institute and professor at the Makeda Department of Chemical Engineering. He also directs the SPF 2050 Center and serves as the associate editor of the Chemistry and Materials Journal. Brian is also an artist and co-founded two companies. He received his PhD in chemical engineering and has given more than 260 invited talks and published more than 280 papers. Okay, and Luke Bassett is the former staff member of the US Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. There he advised Chairman Joe Manchin on climate, renewable energy, energy tax, and research and development policy. In that role, he drafted or negotiated major provisions of the Energy Act, the IRA and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, which together form the new core of our US climate, energy, and economic policy. So please welcome Luke and Brian.
Great. All right, yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Hey. Cacti. So Luke, it's really great to have you here. Thanks, Monique, for the introduction. So Luke visited our Energy Ventures course a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about the Inflation Reduction Act and policy and energy in the context of startup companies, for example. And I think in the last couple of years, we've seen some pretty historic bills and legislation happening. Three major bills that I'm going to ask Luke about, and it's a really interesting time. And this kind of coincided with when I took over as Energy Institute Director. So I started about a year and a half ago, September 1, and then in November, the infrastructure bill passed. And all of a sudden, everyone is talking about hydrogen hubs and all of that. So I have so many questions for you. I guess, first of all, we have a lot of students in the audience. And how did you make your way into what you do and into working in Senator Manchin's group, I guess? I'm really curious about that career path and how you got there.
Well, first, thanks, Brian and University of Texas for inviting me here. It's great to be in Austin. It's great to have brisket for lunch and get out of DC for a little bit. There is a very long answer to the question of how I got where I've been in politics and working for Senator Manchin. But I think the easiest way to start answering that is I am originally from West Virginia, a small town near Huntington. And, proudly from West Virginia, I did go out of state for school and ended up working in politics in DC, both in environmental policy and then in campaign politics, and ended up in the Department of Energy under President Obama. When President Obama left office, I went to a think tank, the Center for American Progress, and then subsequently politics changed. I, thought about a lot of different angles, including leaving DC entirely and going to the private sector. But when the midterms came around in 2018, I actually went home, volunteered some, stayed with my parents, knocked doors a little bit, and got reconnected to Senator Manchin. And I think, after he won re-election, it was truly just a lot of luck. And I went in to talk to him about potentially, staying in my role at Center for American Progress, which, we wrote reports about energy policy. I didn't anticipate him necessarily waving a cap report around, but I wanted to offer him any ideas that we might be able to work with to meet him where he's at and think through energy policy ideas that would benefit the state. Because I really am proud to be from West Virginia, and I really want the state to prosper in this set of technologies and resources that's very important to its history. That morning, that meeting happened on the day that he became the top Democrat, the ranking member on the Energy Committee. And instead, I handed him my resume and said, if there's an opportunity, I'd like to work for you. He hired me, and the rest was the roller coaster of the past 4 years. So it was an incredible honor to work for him and for my parents who are still in West Virginia and the rest of our folks back home.
That's really fascinating to me. Did you have an interest in energy the whole time, or has that been like a passion of yours? Or
well, I studied religion and ethics as an undergrad and in grad school, and from that sort of wound my way from very much a humanities background into the sciences by doing a master's degree in environmental policy. And so I think the mix of recognizing that a lot of our energy issues cross over into how we think about how our communities should work, how we value the best parts of society, our economies, and our jobs, what we really value like most closely to the way we think about ourselves and what we want for the United States or our state, our community. That's been a driving force in that. And then climate change is a huge issue, a lot of science, a lot of policy debates. And I think there's even an ethical quagmire that we could get into over drinks later.
Yeah. When you started, was climate change something you could talk about in your office?
Yeah.
Curious. 2018, it's a little different now than 2018. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I think the senator has had a very strong focus on climate change from the region where he's from. It is coal country. He has very strongly represented miners, including up through the Inflation Reduction Act, where he extended the bipartisan agreement on black lung funding. And he has really been focused on the communities while also recognizing that climate change is a major problem and that we should address it through an all of the above approach, utilize all of the resources and technologies that we have, and move forward.
So something you and I were talking about as we were preparing for the Between the Cacti episode, it's hard for me not to channel Zach Galifianakis right now, say something snarky, but so 2018, 2019, 2020, a lot of things changed politically, the world, COVID, all that. And one major thing was that you and I talked about was the reconciliation process. So do you want to say something about that journey? I know you mentioned that there were some changes around 2019 or so.
Yeah, the major change, I think, was the outcome of the 2020 election. And I think both the sudden majorities, I think you all know the history. It was a 50-50 Senate. Senator Manchin was the 50th vote on the Democratic side in the majority. But as a senator who's had an incredible focus on bipartisan work, especially if you look back to the previous Congress where he worked very closely with Senator Murkowski, who is then chair of the Energy Committee, to put together the Energy Act of 2020, which was the basis for a lot of what we did in the last Congress. I think the reconciliation process, by its nature, is very challenging. I think for either side, for many of the individual senators, it's a challenging process because it is both technically challenging. Everything has to have relevance to the budget. So it's either raising funds or spending funds. There are additional rules, all written by former West Virginia Senator Robert C. Byrd, who was a master of parliamentary process. I would say that it created many problems, both to create policy and to navigate the politics. And I think that, you know, if you look across the Democratic caucus or across the Senate entirely, even looking back to the reconciliation processes under the 116th Congress, when the Republicans had the majority, the 115th, it was not easy for any individual to navigate. And I would just say that I think it raised very serious questions about climate change, about energy security, about fiscal responsibility, and I think Senator Manchin answered them well.
Well, what I find remarkable, I mean, talk about the challenges and the changes, the three bills that you were involved in, which, you know, I'm curious to have you comment more on, are remarkable in many ways, and I think do represent bipartisan sentiment and are trying to solve really challenging issues in the United States. And the United States is very diverse. You know, you talk about West Virginia, Texas, California, and all of that. I mean, do you think that having to have this different reconciliation process led to some of just the fact that it was different in some way? Did it actually force people to collaborate in ways that maybe were difficult, but they wouldn't have done otherwise?
I think that the collaboration you see in the three bills that passed in the last Congress, it does reflect the diversity you're talking about. It reflects really diverse coalitions of senators coming together at various times. So the first, the bipartisan infrastructure law, that was initially sort of led by Senator Portman and Senator Sinema, and then a growing group of senators, Republicans and Democrats, in sort of pairs. It covered many different topics. It spanned a lot of the infrastructure that was really important, way beyond the energy sphere. Then there were various iterations of a reconciliation package that was very focused on the Democratic caucus because of the vote threshold and the technical aspects of getting it through the Senate. And at the same time, on a parallel track, there was the set of bills that became the CHIPS and Science Act. So there were some bills that were largely focused on research and development at institutions like the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy's Office of Science, basic research, much broader than energy, but definitely linked to it, including topics like artificial intelligence and on and on. And then the big part of that bill was this very focused interest in reshoring and strengthening semiconductor manufacturing for economic, national security, a whole host of issues, and largely framed as a global competitiveness perspective that brought a lot of senators together. So you have the somewhat partisan reconciliation process, the two bipartisan bill processes for the infrastructure law and the CHIPS and Science bill. But even within the reconciliation process, Senator Manchin brought together Republicans and Democrats to talk about the needs for energy security and addressing climate change that were not addressed in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but had really come into a new focus because of the conflict in Ukraine. And all of that together led to what he then took forward in what became the Inflation Reduction Act and the permitting package. He saw both of those as one sweeping set of policy issues to address.
Tell us a little, for those, I mean, there are a lot of very deep experts in energy here in the room, but as I said, also some students. I mean, maybe if you had to summarize the Inflation Reduction Act in 1 minute or 2 minutes, I mean, how would you describe it? What is it?
I will admit I am most familiar with the energy and climate portions. So I will likely leave a few things out on the health and fiscal responsibility sides. So I think the parts that I focused on most, it is a historic, if not the largest investment in energy infrastructure and technologies, in addressing climate change, in a lot of things that we care about, we will care about as folks who work in energy policy or in businesses, or will once they graduate. And the pieces that I didn't work directly on also help ensure that we are addressing our fiscal side. So it's internal revenue service modernization. And there are a lot of pieces that are relevant to healthcare, some drug pricing, some fixes to Medicare and I believe Medicaid. And I will stop there on those fronts because I'm just not as well versed. But all of this, there are summaries out there. I think on the energy side, the best resource is cleanenergy.gov, the administration's page on the Inflation Reduction Act. But all told, it is a huge investment, and it is also a focus on thinking through, where the country's headed in a responsible way, because it did address the national debt as well.
Yeah. I mean, if you had to pick a policy out of the Inflation Reduction Act as it relates to energy, what would you pick? Maybe you could pick two. As sort of what you think are kind of the most game-changing or revolutionary in some way that you think are just wow, or that you like the most, or I'm just curious about that. What's the one or two things that you think are just wow, this is something?
Well, I'm really biased. I spent a lot of time drafting a tax credit. It's in section 48C of the tax code. It is the advanced energy manufacturing tax credit, and it focuses on facilities. It had been first written back in the Recovery Act. Senator Stabenow from Michigan had championed it, and we worked with her team to sort of update the list of technologies that factories could produce to gain the credit. But then specifically to address one of Senator Manchin's concerns from day one of my job, how do we invest in the places where jobs are being lost? And those jobs are being lost because of the downturn in many fossil fuel regions around the country, from the larger trend of offshoring, manufacturing, and so on. And it's not just a facility here or a facility there. It also ties into a lot of the revenue sources for local governments. So it's funding for schools, it's overall working conditions or job availability for workers in those places, which has this spiraling effect in a lot of places, including a lot of the counties in West Virginia. So part of working on this tax credit was to set aside within it $4 billion for coal country, and defining that based on where coal power plants had retired or coal mines had closed. And so it's a way to really focus on building factories or retrofitting existing factories to build the next wave of energy technologies in the places where Senator Manchin focused on trying to reinvest, but also where I think a lot of us thinking through these policies were really interested in ensuring that these new jobs were going to go.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, there's so many interesting things in the Inflation Reduction Act. How do you get input? You know, how do you talk to experts? How do people come to you with ideas? You know, you clearly care, you know, a lot about the economy of West Virginia and the legacy of coal and its energy future and all of that. I mean, how do you, because there are so, again, it's just every topic like carbon capture, hydrogen, solar, manufacturing, you know, how do you get input into something like that? What's the process, and do you seek it out? Do people come to you?
It's a bit of both. I think there's probably either an accurate or an outsized conception of what lobbying is like. There are some great lobbyists. There's some incredible trade associations. They do provide really good information. They also provide a lot of so-called fly-ins where they bring companies or members from different organizations that they represent to our offices. I think Senator Manchin's explicit focus on serving the people of West Virginia also led us to go home. I was in regular contact with both folks in state government, folks in organizations, whether they were environmental organizations or labor unions or trade associations within the state. And then through our committee's hearing process, we also invited experts from around the country on any given topic, depending on relevance to the topic, to some degree on trying to have a balanced perspective from, we may invite a researcher from a university, government witness from Department of Energy, CEO from a company, that kind of mix. So it wasn't a perfect process. We definitely didn't cover every base, but it is a flood of information to manage as a Senate staffer.
If I as a citizen had an idea, that I wanted to get to, what's the most effective way to do that?
Well, I left. I left back in October.
Yeah, I know you don't have your current role, but I'm saying someone in
happy
your
to pass it along
position,
as best I can.
Yeah,
but,
or to Senator Manchin. What is the most effective way as a person? Say there's something you care about. What's the most effective way to make your voice heard?
Our policy in my former office was to respond to everything that came in, to take every meeting. And that led to scheduling constraints, to be sure, but I think that there's an interest across the entire Senate for that kind of information, especially when it is unique. So it's not yet another name on the same template kind of message that an organization has put forward. And especially when it relates back to the kind of hopeful information where it's new policy ideas or new interest in your home state for growing businesses, new opportunities or solutions. I think that's something that generally staffers are really hungry for, and it's often the opposite kind of message where it's just, we don't like this, or some other kind of harsh phone call.
Yeah, so I guess the point is you're looking for new ideas, right?
Mm-hmm.
New information, as opposed to the other way around, where it's like, no, this is the way we're going to do it, not listening to anyone. And I think that's an important message, like these days. So I want to open it up to questions. So we have 20 minutes before we've got a reception and all of that. And I know a lot of you probably have some burning questions about the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure bill. So I'm curious if anyone has a question. Carrie King, all right. Assistant Director of the Energy Institute.
Just made the person with the microphone walk away from me. So, yeah, so during the discussions of Inflation Reduction Act and many of these bills, there were all kinds of discussions from Senator Manchin and others about what needs to be paid for, how the government actually spends money. And you're in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which is about physical resources. And we're at an energy conference. Energy has this kind of physical notion to it. So do you have any kind of insights or stories about how much you think our elected officials actually sort of understand the energy things of the economy and how the government actually funds things, in the sense that if the government wants to fund something, they just spend the money to create it. It doesn't have to be paid for, but a lot of our senators and representatives state this, and Manchin was not exactly stating that he didn't understand that, but he often stated he wanted it to be paid for and not increase the deficit, these kinds of things. So any insights into, how you think people, our elected officials, understand these kinds of fundamentals about how the government functions from a fiscal standpoint and the relationship to energy?
So, I think that there are kind of two questions there. So the first, how much does a member of Congress understand any given topic? And you have to remember that, especially in the Senate, each of them is elected to cover the full gamut of topics. Then as they choose or are assigned to committees, they sort of specialize. A lot of that reflects either personal interest or the interest of the states that they represent. So, an example from a different senator, Senator Cantwell had been the ranking member on the Energy Committee immediately before Senator Manchin stepped into that role, in part because she moved over to the Commerce Committee. The Commerce Committee also covers it's commerce, space, and technology. So it covers aviation, it covers a lot of the computing industry, what I would assume natural alignment with a lot of the companies and interests that she both had in her former life before she ran for office, and also reflecting the big companies in Washington, Boeing, Microsoft, on and on. I think as you look across the entire 100 senator landscape, you get a lot of that sorting. And once you do, you can kind of guess that if you're going into any given office, you may need to educate staff and make sure that the staff know the issue so that they can make sure that their bosses know the issue and be successful in that manner. But if you're thinking about a senator who has a definite interest in the topic area, you really have to give them credit, because it is generally, it's not an inch deep and a mile wide. If they've decided to be on a committee, there's an interest there, and it will surprise you where that interest leads. They are, generally speaking, some of the most energetic and curious people, and they will surprise you, shock you, scare you if you're a staffer and you don't know the answer to their question. And so, I think thinking back, working for Senator Manchin, we went on a work trip to visit the International Thermonuclear Reactor, ITER. I'm getting that acronym a little incorrect, but it's the fusion experiment in France. And
what year did you visit that?
We went in March or April of last year.
Okay.
And it was astounding how Senator Manchin jumped into detail and was fascinated by it. And subsequently, we had to do hearings and we took meetings, and it was just a whole new vein of work that previously I would never have guessed that he would have had interest in, but he took to it immediately. So it's a mixed bag in terms of, I think it's surprising when they take interest and sort of bring a depth of knowledge that comes out of left field from, based on their resume or past experience. So then the second part of the question was specifically about energy and natural resources and the pay-fors. I think if you look across the past several Congresses, there's been a lot of interest in paying for spending as it goes out the door. A lot of that has to do both with the long-term spending in the current conversation about the debt ceiling. It's the long-term spending. It's both what we've already committed to pay for and the bills coming due, but it's also spending into the future. That's kind of the highest level version of that. The next level down in a given bill, and so back to the question about the Inflation Reduction Act, that ultimately also depends on the Congressional Budget Office scoring, and they model, they analyze each provision and its cost in, given economic projections of economic growth or stability over time, and what spending might look like, what revenue raisers might look like. That's ultimately where a lot of the specific talking points and facts about paying for a bill come into play, because there's so much uncertainty with with the uptake of tax credits, with the actual ability of an agency to spend through or loan out a given loan authority or credit subsidy, and ultimately with where the economy is headed. No one would have guessed in 2019 where the economy was headed in the next 2 years. So I think there's both an understanding from each senator's perspective of what CBO means and the sort of political validity of that scoring, but I think they also kind of acknowledge a lot of the uncertainty around all of the levers within that.
Another question? Yeah.
Hi, it's fascinating to talk to someone who was there while all this was going on. So I've got sort of a two-part, it's definitely a two-part question. One of them is sort of on the intrigue of how the Senate works and the relationships of people. And Senator Manchin, for a lot of us that were following the Inflation Reduction Act, what became the Inflation Reduction Act, were very disappointed in December, I guess, of 21 when he said, I'm not going to support this anymore. And then in the spring, discussions got started. And then around June, he just said, no, this is not going to work. And I'm not going to support it. And many people, including myself, thought, okay, it's done. We're just not going to get there in this Congress. And then CHIPS Act's passed, and the senator has reconsidered and has decided that the Inflation Reduction Act is, it's going to pay for itself. There's a surplus coming in. It meets his objectives, and here he goes. It set off a firestorm in the relationship between the minority leader and Senator Manchin and other things. So I'm curious if you can share any insights into kind of what was it like to be in the office as he was going back and forth with that, and what caused him to ultimately change his mind. I'm glad he did. And then the second part, the law's been passed now, and I reflect back on the 2018 tax bill, I believe, and I was thinking of 45Q. And many people were waiting till January of 21 before the IRS put out the final rules on 45Q so investment decisions could be made. Now we're looking at that same process with all of the Inflation Reduction Act things, waiting for Treasury to come forward with their guidance. And they're busy. I mean, it's a big, big task. Do you have any? You're not there, so you don't beat on them every day to hurry up and get the stuff out the door. But do you have any insights on how long it might take to get the guidance coming out so people can make firm decisions and financing decisions on those tax credits?
So let me take the second question first. I don't have a lot of insight into Treasury's process beyond the statutory deadlines that are in the law, and I think John Podesta has said publicly a little bit about some of the scheduling of guidance. and they've already issued some of the guidance, especially a good amount in terms of just initial preliminary guidance. So they do have their work cut out for them. It's a lot of material. On the question about the process and the sort of yes, roller coaster that all of us witnessed. There were moments that were incredibly challenging, but I think that throughout all of it, working for Senator Manchin and seeing his focus and determination on, and this may sound a little corny, but truly doing what's best for the country, at least drew me back to work on the days that were easy to sleep in on or worse. And I think that was maybe hardest in 2021, in December of 21, in part because the day after he mentioned the news about Build Back Better, it was a Sunday morning. I tested positive for COVID on Monday, and so I was really knocked out for about a week. But apart from that, I think in the spring and then summer of the following year, a few things happened. First, Putin's invasion of Ukraine fundamentally reshaped the energy economy writ large, but also the conversation on both sides of the aisle, and really deeply about what energy resources, I think it shed a new light on what energy meant to the global economy and what America's role and America's energy resources, how they could play a role strategically, and even in some very vivid ways as a humanitarian element in a lot of what was happening. So I think that was a theme that may not have been reported on, especially in a lot of the political reporting, but was really fundamental to a lot of what was happening. At the same time, again, climate change has been relentless in the background or in full view, depending on where you live in the country or around the world, and that was never lost. So I think the series of events that happened over the summer, which I'll admit are at times a little hazy to remember exactly what happened, but I think that there were a lot of things that had been pretty much agreed to. This is good policy, this is the right number, we're okay with a majority of what went into the Inflation Reduction Act. There were some outstanding issues and negotiations got heated, and I think that there were frustrations on both sides, speaking specifically about leadership, Senator Schumer's team and our team, and specifically between the members. And so the way it played out, I would just say my former boss was determined to see through what he could and to make sure that the bill was on solid footing, both in terms of inflation, in terms of costs to taxpayers, and addressing some of the specific major domestic issues, including gas prices, including the cost of energy, but also making clean energy available, making all of our energy resources cleaner. And so that series of days was fascinating, and books will be written about it, but I think that the sort of nail-biting perspective from the outside was also very different for those of us actually working, because we were just, honestly, we were just back to the grind of negotiating and trying to finish and wrap everything up very quickly. So there is a bit of a gap in information between the media and what's happening on the outside and the worker bees and even the members, but yeah, it was a pretty fascinating time.
Yeah.
This on? All right,
Yeah.
perfect. So thanks a lot for coming to UT and being here. My question is about the development of the IRA going forward. So there's a lot in there, and there's a lot of questions that I think still need to be answered about how certain things are going to get rolled out. So I was at a meeting with the DOE a couple months ago, and the DOE representative literally said, "We're building the plane as we fly it." So, and that's to be expected with something that's big and touches so much stuff, right? Kind of a long rollout period, maybe. My question to you is, do you get the sense that Senator Manchin and the current staff and/or the other representatives that were, invested in developing the bill and the law, do you think they're looking at the next few years, 8 to 10 years, as do you think people will still be working and kind of maybe maneuvering and trying to influence how the DOE is going to execute? Or do you think it's more of a, work is done and kind of, there's obviously a million other balls for everybody to juggle. But so I'm curious if you think there's going to be continuing, a lot of elbow grease and interest from the representatives, just given the massive, thing that it is.
That's a great question. The answer is are people going to continue to work and sort of tinker on it? The simple answer is yes, definitely. There are a few ways to think about it, though. One is just in terms of the political makeup now of the Congress. There will be a heated back and forth on repealing some parts of the IRA, potentially on strengthening some, depending on where you sit politically. I think apart from that, though, in thinking through actual implementation, there are questions a little further out into the future about if, for instance, and hopefully some of the programs are hugely successful and the grant program here or there, or the demonstration funding for, let's say, the industrial facilities, that was a $6 billion program. It turns out to really think through reducing a lot of emissions across even just cement is probably not just a $6 billion problem. Then when you add up all of the other industrial subsectors, steel, aluminum, glass, chemicals, on, it is a huge problem that we don't have all of the technologies for. We certainly don't have demo-ready technologies across the board. So, with a highly successful program, there could be a need to increase funding, continue to evolve how that program functions. There could also be, hopefully not, mistakes. There's some risk involved in new technologies. So there could be moves to reshape and sort of constrain or create guardrails around some of the programs. I think generally speaking, we wrote these with an eye toward the lessons learned from past experience. I think the Recovery Act, especially in the Obama years, put forward a lot of money into technologies that were then able to kickstart entire industries. That's kind of the goal with a lot of the funding in the IRA. I think the other big question is going to be on the tax credits, and that will just involve how they interact with technologies that are fundamentally ready to commercialize and scale, and we'll see what happens. But it's an excellent question. It does mean that there's a lot of work for people who want to go work in the federal government, both the executive branch and the Congress, which I highly recommend for anyone to do. It's an incredible experience. It's very fulfilling. It's very challenging work too.
So the last word, following on Jesse's question, I don't know if I can paraphrase, like the Inflation Reduction Act won't be like a lightning rod the way Obamacare was, right? When people talk about Obamacare, it seems like we're just going to repeal the whole thing. There's never like tweaks or anything like that. To me, it seems like the Inflation Reduction Act, what it's put forward is probably going to stick. And I don't really hear people saying you should repeal the Inflation Reduction Act. I think it's a lot more of the details, like what exactly will get in the tax code and all that. I mean, is that your sense? Do you think that the sentiment put forward in the Inflation Reduction Act, and that we do need to do some things differently to address climate change, that we do need some incentives to, increase our energy productivity and our security in the United States? I mean, do you feel like what's being put forward in the IRA is going to stick?
Yeah, I really do think so. I think there are a few reasons for it. First, the senators' true deep focus on all of the technologies, whether that was within a single set of policies like the tax credits, which shift over time, the power sector tax credits shift over time to being technology neutral, or within the band of technologies in programs funded through the Department of Energy. That's going to include carbon capture. It includes hydrogen from all fuel sources. It includes nuclear. The list goes on and on. It includes renewables, efficiency. And so both when you think of the growing markets, the growing businesses, the approach across a lot of the policies to, again, reinvest in communities where jobs have been lost in the energy sector, I think you'll see new coalitions that then, when representatives want to repeal something for purely political reasons, maybe there are voices in their district or state that are pushing back against it in new ways. I think the other huge factor in all of it is we have suddenly totally reshaped how other countries and the EU are approaching climate change. There are a lot of conversations, and there's a little bit of competitive frustration or some sort of vibe about how the United States is addressing this issue now. And suddenly I think we will be both in new trade relationships and in new competitive relationships that reinforce and help grow the domestic industries and help sort of diminish the need or desire to repeal or otherwise change the Inflation Reduction Act.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Luke. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.